Good evening. Thanks to everybody for coming. My name is Fraser Haney. I'm the Conservation Director at the Mojave Desert Land Trust. And as I thought about the final lecture tonight here at the college, I wanted us to take a second and just reflect back on Joshua Tree National Park and the designation of the national park after a pretty serious effort by Minerva Hoyt. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that story. The presidential proclamation by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1936. And the threats at that time in 1936 that caused the park to be designated were well known in our mythology, right? Cactus gathering and people kind of plundering the desert. And we wanted somewhere to be sacrosanct, and Joshua Tree became our sacrosanct piece of desert, and it's led to so much more. But we find ourselves in a different world now, and the threats that we're going to talk about a little bit tonight and that I think we should think about as we go into the summertime here are things like global warming, something certainly was on nobody's mind in 1936, or the threat of a changing fire regime and invasive plants in the park, or particularly irritating and frustrating is the threat of graffiti in our national park. So all these reasons are why it's so important that the visitors to Joshua Tree and all of us continue to be educated about the park and its resource values, and that's why it's so important to have the Joshua Tree National Park Association. The park is really lucky to have this nonprofit partner. Their mission is to assist in the natural and cultural resource preservation and the educational activities of Joshua Tree National Park. To do this, the association operates 4 visitor center bookstores that are often the first stop for visitors from all around the world. The association also raises funds for the park through public events and a membership program. I hope all of you are members of the association if you're in this room tonight. If you're not already a member and you'd like to sign up, there's some folks over at the table there that can help you do that. The association also operates the Desert Institute, which offers classes taught by experts in natural sciences, cultural history, and the arts, as well as coordinating this Black Rock Lecture Series. I'd like to thank the board members that are in attendance tonight, and if I miss anybody, you'll have to raise your hand and step up. But thanks to Karen Tracy, Bill Truesdale, and Lorraine Turk for being here tonight. Can we get a round of applause for the board of directors? I'd also like to thank Meg Foley in the back of the room for all of her work as the executive director at the association. And we want to give a really great thanks to Dr. Jeff Cummings, who is now the president of Copper Mountain College, not the interim president. So let's give Jeff a hand. And as Kevin brought to my attention tonight, this idea had its beginnings with Paul Delaney and Pam Kersey. So let's give them a round of applause for bringing the lecture series here tonight. And to the mayor of Yucca Valley, Mr. George Huntington, we'd just like to recognize you and say thanks for attending and being a regular guest. So we're going to hear about a variety of topics tonight, and as we think about how we can all take action and what's achievable. So often we have some pretty big dreams about what we'd like to do, and when we actually get to them, we find they're pretty hard to take a lot of energy. I think a lot of us in the room know that. So with this in mind, I'm excited to introduce our expert panel. Each one of these folks, you probably recognize them, specializes in some part of taking action in our local community and on behalf of the park. So first off on our list is the Superintendent of Joshua Tree National Park, Mr. David Smith. David has a Bachelor of Science from UC Berkeley in forestry. He also has a master's degree from Stephen F. Austin or Texas State University in resource interpretation. He started with the Park Service in 1992, and he's worked at Canyonlands, Arches, and Grand Canyon. Most recently, he was the superintendent at Brown versus the Board of Education in Kansas. He's also served on the House Natural Resources Committee for 2 years, working on National Park Service legislation. He has a husband, John, for 25 years, and they're raising their son and daughter here with us in Joshua Tree now. So please give a round of applause to David Smith.
It's always tough to follow Fraser with those dulcet tones and his incredible ability to speak. I've got a son and daughter. Notice that neither one of them wants to be listening to their papa speak right now. They're out either playing or far away from me right now. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming tonight. It's great to see so many friends, advocates for this park. It's great to see the Truesdales and Joe and Marilyn here. People that were my mentors when I was a park ranger at this place, 20 years ago, who have kind of set the foundation for me today. It's great to see Lizzie down there talking about, how great it is to be out hiking in the park and various things. Lots of friends, so it's good to be here tonight. When I spoke to you 6 months ago, when I first arrived at this park, we did the State of the Park address that evening, and I had some big concerns. The biggest concern was relevancy. Is Joshua Tree National Park, are our national parks still relevant for the American community? My other big concern were the effects of global warming and what that would do to Joshua Tree National Park in the future. Sadly, in the last 6 months, we have not solved those two problems. They are still the two biggest things that sometimes keep me up at night. Usually I'm so tired at the end of the day that I fall asleep. It's not a big issue. But they still bother me a lot. We're coming a long way. I will say that. Last year we had 1.6 million people come into Joshua Tree. This year we're on target for 2 million visitors coming into Joshua Tree. Our campgrounds are full half the year. Our programs that we give are packed. It's difficult to get into the park on most weekends. That means that for a lot of Americans and people around the globe, Joshua Tree is relevant to them. It's giving them something that they need. But in this last year, the last 2 years, we've seen things like graffiti inside the park. Graffiti to a degree that we never ever anticipated inside of a national park unit. How is that possible? I think it's possible because Joshua Tree may not be relevant for as many people as it could be. Luckily, we have partners that we've discovered since I spoke to you last time, like the Otis School of Design in Los Angeles. I just was out there last week meeting with some of their undergraduate students. They finished their semester course, which was focusing in on graffiti at Joshua Tree and solutions for it. And to have these brilliant young people together to come up with ideas about how we can solve some of those problems. It was an amazing process. One of my favorite ideas that they came up with was, work with adolescents, work with teenage kids, specifically look at maybe some of the alternative high schools that we have in the Morongo Basin, and teach them to make films. Bring them into the park. Teach them how to write a script, how to design a movie, how to do the whole production process, and in the process of doing that, learn to love the park. What a neat idea. I'm a forester by trade. I'm not really good at designing movies, but luckily we have partners who are. So relevancy is building. I was reading in the local newspaper down in Palm Springs about school groups coming into the park for the very first time, boys and girls clubs coming into the park and connecting with rangers and having these amazing experiences. A month ago, I was up at Black Rock camping out with a group from Los Angeles, a local preacher who I'd met at Climb Smart. She loved Joshua Tree. She said, this is the place where kids need to come. They need to connect with the land. So she said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab 40 of my most precious commodities, my children. I'm going to bring them up to Black Rock, and I want you to be with me, Ranger Dave. I want you to spend the night with me so we can explore the park together. And I sat around with these kids. Not one of these kids had ever been to a national park in their lives. They were 16, 17, 18-year-old kids. They'd never been to a national park. How is that possible? Well, it's possible because it's not relevant to them. And luckily, there are advocates out there like this one pastor who brought her kids to the park. So we're moving in a good direction. Yeah, we have lots of work to do. And thank God we've got partners like JTNPA that help raise money so that we can use those soft funds to pay for education. Thank God we've got Kevin over there who's reaching out to adult audiences and bringing them into the park through the Desert Institute and providing interpretive education that we can't do with the resources that we have right now. So those are good things. we're moving in a good direction. You know, climate change, though, does bother me. I've been, this last week, hammered with emails regarding the fire conditions inside the park. You know, we're going to have our annual get-together with Forest Service and BLM when we sit around and we worry about, will this park exist, you know, come October at the end of the fire season. And, you know, you go up into Covington Flats, you go up into the northwestern corner of the park, and what do you see? You see exotic weeds doing really, really well. Better than they've done in the last 4 or 5 years during the drought. We did get some rain in that portion of the park this last year, which indicates that we have a fine fuel supply right now, which may indicate an active fire season. You know, we've talked about this a little bit over the last 6 months, but in case you don't know, those weeds weren't always there at Joshua Tree. They are a new arrival. You know, they came when pioneers came out to this area. They came with cattle, and now they become the dominant fine fuel. You know, 150 years ago, when we got a lightning strike during the monsoon season, you know, up at Nolina Peak, you'd hit a Joshua tree and it would burn down, and that was about it. Now you get a lightning strike and the fire doesn't stop. All those fine fuels keep on going. So that bothers me. So I talked to my FMO, my fire management officer. I talked to Andrea, my chief of resources back there. It's like, well, what can we do? This is a national park. We're supposed to preserve these places. We're not supposed to change them at all. Do we actually put in fire breaks to actually stop fire? Because we know the fire is going to come. There's nothing we can do about it. Do we use herbicides inside of a park to create an artificial fire break? You know, we're going to have to think outside the box. We're going to have to compromise our values as environmentalists and naturalists if we're actually going to deal with these problems. I was at dinner tonight. We were talking about, you know, philosophies in life. You know, when I came here 8 months ago, you know, the idea of building a wind farm or a solar tower that could fry birds from, you know, every bird coming through this area, the idea of a pump storage unit inside right next to the park boundaries, those things frightened me beyond belief. I got a chance to go hiking with our Secretary of Interior this last year when she was out here in January and February. And she said, you know, I told her these concerns that I had. And she goes, yeah, they're my concerns too. Because our national parks they're sacrosanct. They're there for my children so they can come back and enjoy those places when they get old and decide to have children. More of my family coming. There's cousin Jojo, yay. They're sacrosanct. They're sacred places that we need to preserve. But she said, we have to actually think about the real threats. What is the biggest threat that we have to your park right now? What is the biggest threat that we have to all of our national parks? It's global warming. We need to find solutions and we need to make compromises. Does that mean we give up on everything we believe in? No, of course not. But maybe sometimes we have to actually think there is a greater good here and we have to look for solutions. And things that would have been untenable, you know, to me 20, 30 years ago, today we have to look at. I'm not advocating, you know, loading us up with large solar farms and you know, solar towers and windmills everywhere in migration patterns, but we have to look at the bigger picture. And it's tough. As a park manager, I've got to do that. I don't like it, but I've got to do that. There's only so much I can do with electric cars with a staff of 100 people. The big issues are all that smog that's coming in from Los Angeles that's feeding my weeds with nitrogen. And so they take off every single year. How can I stop that? I can stop it by getting the folks in Riverside and San Bernardino and LA to commit to producing less carbon dioxide and carbon and nitrogen into the air. So those are the things that are on the back of my mind. The state of the park, yeah, it's good. I got a great staff. I love the people that work at that park. They are committed. They are crazy committed. Andrea over there, she's crazy committed. She's putting in like 50 or 60 hours a week. I can't get her to stop working. I got a public that's fantastic. They volunteer hundreds and thousands of hours. There's a church group coming by this weekend that wants to work up at Black Rock. You know, they want to put in 4 hours and it's like 100 kids. That's tremendous. What they can do in 4 hours is outstanding. So I got a lot of good things happening, but I still have a lot of fears. And you're part of that solution too. So I could babble on for a long time, and I don't want to babble on for a long time because these guys are far more articulate than I am. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to hearing your questions.
Well, David, you always are invigorating, and you always make me want to get off my butt and do something. So thank you. Let's go. Our next speaker is Christopher McDonald. He is the Natural Resource Advisor for the University of California's Cooperative Extension, and he works in southeastern California in San Bernardino, Riverside, San Diego, and Imperial counties. His expertise is in managing plants in the wildlands with an emphasis on managing weeds and restoring native plants. So his research focuses on enhancing nature preserves, our wildlands, different backyards, and by increasing native plants. He also conducts research and extension programs on backyard wildlife, including pollination, as well as fire ecology, the analysis of management techniques, including chemical and mechanical control methods. Chris has conducted research in the southwestern United States for over a decade, working almost exclusively in arid and semi-arid environments. So please, a round of applause for Chris McDonald.
I don't know if I'm going to be more articulate. I don't even know if I'm going to be less rambly. Ooh.
And I'm going to turn the lights off.
Awesome.
And, you've got a slide.
Is this me here? Do not take. All right, I'm probably going to need to point, but I'm not going to be able to. All right. Okay. So I came up. How many of you seen me talk before? 1, 2.
Have I seen this one?
No, but you've seen me talk before. Thank you. Okay. So, how many people have seen me talk before? 2. Okay. Most of you are new. The vast majority. That's great. I have a very easygoing freestyle, so I'm not entirely sure that I'm going to, maybe April will pull up with the more technical, less rambling. But anyways, I thought it'd be fun to have a very bureaucratic title. Achievable action items. What you can do. And so David actually set me up. What can you do? What can we do? Nope. Wait, let's try. Hang on. What can you?
Up goes.
Okay. Am I not? Is this on? Let's try.
Here, I'll work on that.
I didn't get a technical thing.
I'll work on that. You keep going.
Okay. All right. So what you can do, you can create habitat in your backyard. Now, to some of us, this is news. My backyard, could look like this. Fire pit, Sunday night football game going on. Looks like a pretty awesome place if you're into, football and hanging out. Pool, xeriscape, agaves, saguaros, or some sort of tall columnar cacti, or something, rocks, Palo Verde, Ocotillo, a little more natural. There's the gradient going on there. I'm sorry?
The one in the lower right is the nicest.
The one. Thank you. Prove my point. But the idea here is that your backyard is a part of nature. There is no indoors-outdoor separation. We are all on the same planet. There's no such thing as not in nature. Our backyard is part of nature. Now, the inside of this gym is natural. However, the biodiversity of this gym is pretty much one species. Hit me up. So one of the I'm an academic. I got to give you a little lecture. So this is the common food web, and I've got 10 minutes, right? Okay, I got to time myself. This is the standard food web. We got plants on the bottoms. We got things that eat plants in the middle, and then we got the things that eat the things in the top. Looks great, awesome. But next slide. It has almost no basis in reality to how reality actually works. So you can ignore the units, but just look at the size of the bars there. We've got a whole bunch of sunlight, which is actually farther than the scale of this diagram. We've got a lot of plants. We've got a fairly small number of grasshoppers and insects and herbivores. We've got a relatively small number of insectivores. And then we've got an even smaller number of secondary consumers or tertiary consumers. So when we have the mental picture of what the food web looks like, go back one slide. Oh, no, you can do that. That's fine. Okay. The hawk and the fox are really, really big. In reality, the amount of biomass or energy that they occupy on the landscape is really, really small. They have to eat a lot of rodents to be able to just grow into a full-sized hawk. And those rodents have to eat a lot of seed to grow into full-sized rodents. And those plants have to produce a lot, or say, the seeds are created by a lot of plants that are producing all year long and consuming the sunlight. So the cartoon, are any of you graphic designers, by the way? Because anyways, I really wanted to chat with a graphic designer to figure out like where they get these ideas, and I'm not going to have that opportunity tonight. But this is about you, not really about me, I'm sorry. And so we have this concept of the food web where the things on top are really, really big. But the food web is completely bottom-based. It's this giant pyramid. And then we go into our backyards and we have this concept of, well, there should be these big giant hawks and deers and things. And the only way to get that in your backyard is with a whole bunch of plants. Go ahead and go forward. Here we go. And so I've kind of dumbed down the food web, but the scale is accurate here. If we're getting a lizard in our backyard, we're looking at the 1%. And what Occupy Wall Street or whatnot. This is the 1%. And then the butterflies and stuff are the 10%. And the plants are the 100%. So we're really looking at our backyards or any habitat that we're creating, we're looking at plants that feed everything going up, and it gets smaller and smaller as it gets to the top. And it gets really small. And we're looking at a lizard that's the 1% of the energy in the backyard or the ecosystem, wherever, compared to the 100% of plants. So I think that's just absolutely phenomenal. And every time I look at it, it blows my mind. And every time I look at the graphic designer style food web, it's all backwards, and it's frustrating. Go ahead. So that's point number one. We need a lot of plants in our backyard, which is why I know, because I'm a mind reader, why you like the backyard over there, because it has a lot of plants in it. It's the most natural, granted it's a human-dominated ecosystem, but that's okay. We live in what some scientists are now calling the Anthropocene. It's the geologic era where humans are the dominating factor. And since humans are the dominating factor, why don't we dominate to the advantage of other species? Ooh, you're nodding your head. All right. Whew. I got one convert. Okay.
You're among friends here.
So I think I said my point already. There's a lot of plants in the food web, and the backyard that will house the most biodiversity has the most plants. Go ahead. Wildlife loves plants. That's what I've been rambling on for about 5 minutes here. Wildlife loves plants. Oh, I forgot to tell you, this lecture is actually about an hour and a half long, and I'm condensing it into 10 minutes, which is why on my first slide I had a rainbow, because we're really having wishful thinking here to try and get me down to 10 minutes. Okay. So, you want things in your backyard that are really cool? Butterflies, birds, bees? You want plants in your backyard. I can guarantee you that's how it works. I'm a scientist. You can trust me. Or you don't have to. I don't know. And the more plants, the merrier the wildlife. Don't quote me on that. That's not very science-y, but it works. So now I know you're asking, because I've led you on this path, and you're like, what kind of plants do I want in my yard? And if you're grumpy, you're saying, can't I just plant any plant in my backyard? Because you don't believe me yet. And I understand when you go down to the nursery that they kind of look like this, and it's very intimidating. You walk in, and they've got plants everywhere. And if you're not a plant person like me, you get overwhelmed. And I get overwhelmed a little bit, but I kind of filter everything out because I know I know the secret, but I'm going to teach you the secret in 3 minutes here. So what kind of plants do you want in your backyard? Go ahead. Well, if you're wildlife, you need food, water, and shelter. And if we can all go back to high school biology, or maybe they're now teaching this in like middle school and elementary school, which is really cool that the education standards are going up and little kids are learning about butterflies. But the food for butterflies are leaves. Yeah, they need nectar, so that they do need nectar plants, but their main food source is plants. Monarchs need milkweeds. Yeah, they can have a whole bunch of different flowers that they feed on as the adults, and I'm not saying that that's not important. But we also need food plants for all of the stages of wildlife, not just the adults. Go ahead and hit it. Oh, this is where you get to boo and cheer. And if you don't like my talk, you can boo when I boo, and then you can just boo at me and I won't know it because you're booing. So lantana is a semi-tropical plant from Central and Southern America, and we have mesquite. So we have the non-native versus the native. Dun, dun, dun. So lantana, you can boo. Mesquite, you can cheer. Or if you want to boo it with me, you can boo at lantana when I talk about it. Okay. There's kind of how to identify it, pictures. Go ahead. So, oh, I stepped on my own toes. Oh well. But I just went through the literature and looked to see how many lantana, how many species of caterpillars are found on lantana. Lantana is the host plant for, how many species of caterpillars. And then in California, how much wildlife is actually using lantana. And it's kind of an apples to oranges comparison. However, both species are incredibly invasive, and so scientists have gone looking for bugs that will eat both of these plants, so that way they can take them to other parts of the world. Namely Southeast Asia, mesquite is just horribly problematic, and lantana is problematic in tropical places like Florida. So scientists have gone looking for bugs on these plants. So it's not a complete unfair comparison. And so scientists found 14 species of moths, or butterflies, that are found on lantana species. But when you bring that plant to California, there's only one species of moth that can eat lantana. Go ahead. Oh, you were supposed to boo at that. Boo! Sorry. Compared to mesquite, there are 17 families of Lepidoptera that use mesquite as a host plant. There are 4 species of moths just in the Noctuidae family that use mesquite. So there's something about taking a plant, pulling it from its origin, plunking it down in a new part of the world where the local wildlife just can't use it. I'm not saying lantana isn't a beautiful plant. It's not useful for wildlife. They might find it as a nectar source. But 14 species of butterflies and moths use it in its native range, and only 1 use it here. There's this filtering that's going on. Go ahead. Oh, I'm a scientist. I have to show you graphs. So this is a study from the eastern US, but the science is exactly the same, and that's why I showed you with lantana and mesquite. On the left is the number of Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths, that are found on introduced plants. And on the right is the number of butterflies and moths found on native ornamental plants. Now you have to be really blind to see that the right side is really, really high and the left side isn't. Hit it again. And if you didn't get the point then, I'm going to hit you over the head 3 times. So this is actually maybe 3 times, because there's 4 here, but anyways. So this is another study back east where they looked at the number of native species, and then the number of native species in gardens where they grew from scratch. They planted a native plant garden versus an ornamental, non-native ornamental plant garden. And in every single case, the line that has the native plants has more wildlife species visiting it than the dotted line, which is the exotic ornamentals. In every single case. And my point number 2 here is that you didn't have to get a lot of species before the 2 lines start to go. Once you get about 4 plant species in your garden, you have more wildlife in your garden. 4 plant species. That's really doable. That's something that can be done. What can be done? You can plant native plants in your landscape, and you don't need a lot of them to actually get wildlife in your backyard. Really cool stuff. Yeah, native plants are beautiful. They're full of texture and color and variety. They attract all sorts of wildlife, and they're drought tolerant. Go ahead. Here's a plant list if you really, really want to know what plants work well. Some of these plants are really best suited for Coachella. Some of these plants will work up here. But it's all about native plants. Landscaping with native plants brings wildlife into your backyard. The bees, the butterflies, and the birds. Go ahead. And help is out there. There's a lot of organizations that are finally getting around to this. The science is actually really, really behind the advocacy part of this. We need a lot more science to figure out how many native plants, what types, the details of it. But the general picture is phenomenally clear. You bring native plants in your backyard, you get this much wildlife. You get exotic plants in your backyard, and you get this much wildlife. I showed you the graph. Obviously, it has to be true. It's a graph, right? You knew the end of my joke before I even said it. Awesome. All right. Go ahead. Oh. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris. That was great. And locally, I wouldn't be doing my job unless I reminded you all that locally the Morongo Basin Conservation Association has a great native plant program, and you could check in with them to find out a little bit more about some of the things they do. Our next and last speaker, before we get to her, if you have questions, we're going to be handing out question cards after we hear from April. They'll come up to me, and I'll be asking questions of the panel. So start to run some questions through your head right now, so you have them ready when she's done. So our last speaker is April Sall, and it's a real pleasure to be introducing April to you tonight. As most of you know, she's now the former Preserve Manager and Conservation Director at the Wildlands Conservancy, where she was at for over 10 years, and she still serves on their board of directors. She was born and raised here in the Morongo Basin. She's actually a third generation to Pioneer Town and Pipes Canyon specifically. She's got a degree in biology from Humboldt State University and has worked on many local and regional conservation efforts throughout California, but not just limited to the wildlands preserves. She's worked a lot on renewable energy projects and policy like the DRECP, regional land use planning efforts like the Morongo Basin Conservation Priorities Report, different wildlife corps efforts, desert legislation like the current California Desert Conservation and Recreation Act. She's a chair and board member of the California Desert Coalition. She's been on the BLM Desert Advisory Council since 2009, and she's on the board of advisors for the Morongo Basin Conservation Association, along with all kinds of stuff else. As I read that, I think about how many times the word desert shows up in April's background, and that tells you something about where April's been and about how much she's worked for our community. So April's here to bring us on home. Please welcome April Sall.
All right, thank you. Well, so I wanted to, when we start off here, just have you think for a moment about why you live here and the things that you value. And why that's important is we all get caught in a little bit of a trap, if you will, of thinking that somebody else or a big organization or a government entity like the National Park Service is taking care of those values for us. And we can't do that. And I'm here to relight a fire under all of us to remind us that it's our responsibility, go ahead and click, to play an advocacy role and to share what's important to us and to advocate for the preservation and conservation of those values and those places. And behind me you'll see a slideshow of some pretty places that are probably familiar to you in the Morongo Basin and beyond. And these are places that have had, they've had advocates and they've had champions to preserve them. But land is never saved. It's always being saved. And it's a continuum. And it's something that we have to remind ourselves to be a part of all the time. And whether there's new threats, like the threats to the national park, or there's something new going on in your community, or any other number of topics that we've talked about in this entire series for the Black Rock series this year, there's constantly items that need more support. They need funds, they need volunteers, they need your voice. And it's something that it's very easy for us in sort of our daily life to say, well, I'm too busy to go to that meeting, or I'm too busy to work on XYZ campaign. And I'm here to kind of remind us the role that we all play and the difference we can make, not only on a daily basis, but at moments in time where we have more to give, to contribute to various campaigns and to protect the values that we all have and why we live in this special place. So I think my time slides are almost up here, but you know, it's really about partnerships, and you hear about the partnerships with the National Park Service and the Joshua National Park Association and Mojave Desert Land Trust and the Wildlands Conservancy, and you hear about all the entities. But there's partnerships with all of you as individuals on a daily basis, and it's really important that we keep nurturing those. And those partnerships are really important for a variety of reasons, because there's the obvious that we often talk about when it comes to things like you know, amount of money or congressional, you know, budgets or resources or influence. But there are values that we all can bring and experience that we all can bring to these causes that are incredibly important. And I think we're going to be finished here. I wanted to, bring it home with the desert there, but I want to highlight some of the partnerships some more, because, you know, we're familiar with conservation in terms of, for instance, Joshua National Park or the San Marino National Forest, because those are places that have hiking trails and they have amenities for us to enjoy. But sometimes those government entities can't always be as nimble or as available for various causes. And that's where it's really important that we have individual and grassroots efforts that can supplement and strengthen our federal efforts. And so, as I mentioned, there are the obvious things like resources and staff and dollars that partnerships are important. But advocacy and voice is something I wanted to talk about. Renewable energy is the perfect example. Renewable energy projects threaten a lot of our open spaces and national parks and treasured landscapes. But the national parks and some of our federal partners can't go to a public hearing and take a position on Bright Source solar power tower, for example, because they're part of Department of Interior and they're charged with permitting a certain number of renewable energy projects in this country. And that's where more local voices or nonprofit or grassroots voices can help supplement and talk about where we can cite renewable energy projects to protect those valuable resources. Keep going. There's also the availability of information and science, and some entities can bring a lot of value that others may not have the access to. And the UC Cooperative Extension is a perfect example of a great source of science that, I gotta say, many of us probably don't use enough, but it's really an opportunity to enhance those partnerships. We also have changes in the amount of energy and time that entities can provide at various times in a campaign, and so it's important to have diversity. And the opportunity is not always there for certain organizations or entities to participate at a level that's needed. And I think there's one more. And obviously we have more ideas and we have the benefit of group dynamics when we partner. So try and go ahead and click these next few. They're unfortunately on a timer. I thought I was going to have control of my own thing here. But we've already mentioned some of the federal conservation efforts, and there are many more nonprofits. Go ahead forward. Then I could list here, but here are a few that we partner with regularly and are a big part of the local conservation in the Morongo Basin. Go ahead. And one of the things that is really important that you've heard a lot about is connectivity. And we talk about it in terms of climate change, we talk about it in terms of fire regimes. Many of the threats that were discussed earlier are important, and connectivity of habitat is one of the ways that we can help offset the impacts. I'm going to give a few local examples, and go ahead, Fraser. So we're not going to go through this whole list, but many of you are already familiar with wildlife corridors and why they're important. Essentially, it's to preserve species by allowing connection to other habitat sources. So whether there's a fire or there's climate change pressures or there's, new road impacts, species need the ability to move, and that includes plant species. So we often say wildlife corridors, and I should correct myself right now in using that term. They're really ecological corridors, and we need to keep large places like Joshua National Park and Mojave National Preserve and Death Valley connected, and especially with threats that we have yet to identify, including how these environments are going to respond to climate change. Continue. And you can go through the next two or three quickly. So there's an organization called South Coast Wildlands that did some prioritization of connections. And one of the ones you're familiar with here is the connection with San Bernardino, Little San Bernardino Mountains. And Highway 62 is the red line kind of in the middle of that slide on a diagonal. And there's a few focal species that were identified. And this has been a priority for many of the conservation organizations in this region for decades. And yet we still had, some new Caltrans projects over the last few years and things that continue to impede wildlife connectivity and plant connectivity in this area. So the point being, again, that even though there are groups and there have been funds and there have been acquisitions from MDLT and Wildlands and Friends of the Desert, it's not done yet, and it's an ongoing process that needs continual management and continual engagement. Keep going. These are just, this is an example of what it looks like on the ground, and because of the highway, there are a few chances for wildlife to cross, so we're always looking at more opportunities for wildlife connectivity and ecological connectivity. Keep going. I wanted to give a quick example, and many of you are familiar with the Catalyst purchase that Wildlands Conservancy did, but I wanted to get more into the lessons learned from that. So this map, just for some orientation, the tan color is Joshua National Park in the bottom, Mojave National Preserve sort of in the middle upper right, and then you can just see the lower part of Death Valley. And the gray units are military installations. So you see all the red in the middle of the page, and that is part of the Catalyst acquisition. Just a really quick backstory, go ahead, Fraser, is the Catalyst purchase was completed by Wildlands over a number of years, and Catalyst is the real estate arm of the railroads. So to encourage westward expansion, Congress gave the railroads every other section of land across the Southwest, and we ended up with hundreds and hundreds of square miles of railroad private land. So in California, in the California desert, we had a really unique opportunity to acquire these lands because they came up for sale all at once. Catalyst Corporation wanted to liquidate assets. And Wildlands Conservancy was a very young organization, was only about 4 years old at the time. And at a time when we could have been focusing on endowing ourselves or building our preserve system, this huge landscape came up for sale, and it was going to connect essentially Joshua National Park to Death Valley National Preserve through public ownership and public conservation land. And go ahead. Wildlands Conservancy worked with Senator Feinstein and several partners, and it was taking, after about a year, we decided to just raise a chunk of the money ourselves and move forward with the purchase. It ended up being the largest land gift in U.S. history, and we thought, great job. We've done the biggest wildlife corridor, in California. Our job is done. And then renewable energy change the game. So I call it the learning curve, but go ahead. As I mentioned, a dear friend and mentor who's since passed away was once asked about his legacy in starting the California Coastal Commission, and he said, "The coast is never saved, it's always being saved." And I opened with that, but it's something that I think as land managers and as conservationists, we have to continue to remind ourselves that on this continuum of, you know, all of the volunteer work and advocacy work that we all do, it's important to refuel ourselves and to keep contributing, but also to bring new advocates to the table, because our work is never done, and there's always more to do. So after Wildlands completed the Catalyst purchase, and we'll go through the next few really quickly, Fraser, there were about 1.2 million acres of the California desert that went under application for renewable energy development. And I lived in a solar house off the grid for 10 years, big supporter of renewable energy. Go one more. This is a blow up, and the color's a little hard to see, so the next map you'll be able to see better. But there's a lot of orange and yellow on this map, and they're little polygons of renewable energy projects. And this is a flashback to 2008, so don't worry, the horror story's almost over here. But if you go to the next one, the black outline is just sort of a little bit of a recapture of what was at stake. And there was a proposal, basically, that was being pushed forward with the Department of Interior at the time to develop within that swath, within the black lines. And it would have bisected the Mojave Desert, which, by the way, is one of the most intact ecosystems on the planet. And that was, for many of you in the room, a very challenging and somewhat traumatic time. There's a lot of faces here that were part of this discussion. Keep going. And that's where individual efforts and grassroots efforts are really important, because we have amazing nonprofits and we have amazing federal partners. But it comes down to the day-to-day and having people to man the booths and to write letters and to make phone calls. And these things have been important in a number of campaigns that many of you recognize. We had the Green Path North story and a perfect David and Goliath example where the Department of Water and Power, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, was attempting to pull another Owens Valley and sort of pave their way over our small desert communities. And there were many people, myself included at the time, that said, can we make a difference? Can we stop this train that's coming at us? And it's really important to give examples of our victories, because they're sometimes far and few between, but this region has been very successful in a lot of advocacy campaigns that have worked in our favor. The bobcat conservation and protection is another example. We've had a lot of victories in renewable energy planning with San Bernardino County and regarding the DRECP. And we recently had the Bowman Solar project that was voted down by the Board of Supervisors with a 3-2 vote. Yeah, and the third vote was an urban supervisor that is new to the board. And that just speaks to the importance of all of you and locals and individuals educating our decision makers. Next. So victories are an important reward, but we don't always get those. And sometimes, we can kind of lose sight of the stamina and the endurance it takes to work on these issues. But it's really important that we remember that not only do we need to advocate and speak up for the things that are important, but we need to bring new people and our youth into the conversation. And I wanted to end with this quote from Aldo Leopold, because I think it helps tie everyone's presentations together. It says, "Conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest." And so whether it's, pollinators and native plants in your backyard, or how you talk to or advocate with your local city council members or board of supervisors on a particular issue, it's really going to come down to what we all do as individuals on this landscape and how we can protect it for current and future generations. So Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks very much to our speakers. So we're going to go ahead and start to pass out question cards. If you have a question that you'd like to get a card for, just raise your hand, and somebody will come to you and give you a slip of paper. You can write down a particular panelist's name if you want to address the question to a particular person, or you can not put any name on it and either let me or the panelists choose. We'll see where it goes. I was just reminded by one of our panelists that you could take action tonight. There's a proposal by Senator Feinstein called the California Desert Conservation and Recreation Act, and April is holding some postcards that we're sending in to our one of our local officials in support of this bill. So if you want to sign a postcard, see April after the event. Okay, so this one is for the lantana versus mesquite guy. I think you appreciate that, right?
Down already, isn't that?
They say your amazing graph of insect and Lepidoptera use of native versus exotic plant species was based on an East Coast study. Any similar studies done on the West Coast or in the desert in particular?
No, most of the researchers who've been looking at this, and when I say most, I mean the 4 people who are looking at this are all from the East Coast. There's virtually no one on the West Coast who's done any studies looking at how native plants attract native pollinators. But the general principle is there that most wildlife needs, so birds need some sort of insects during the nesting season, and insects are very host specific on what types of plants they use. So there's a very tight linkage between native plants and the wildlife you want in your backyard. No one has done these studies in California or the Western US. But if you have money, I know people who could do these kind of studies, namely me, but and every time I say that, everybody laughs, but no one throws me $100, so. But yeah, I'm working on grants and stuff like that, trying to do some of these studies and using volunteers to help with this to defray costs. I just haven't been successful on any grants yet. So I'm hoping that in the next 5 years or so that, yes, we will have one study at least, but the science just isn't there yet. There aren't enough scientists working on this.
What would be your study?
What
is specifically your, if you got some money,
If I had money, I would take common ornamental plants in Southern California. I'd grow them out in probably 4 different locations, and then I'd use native ornamental plants as well. I'd partner with an entomologist and have them do insect surveys, and I'd partner with gardeners to then, one, have the gardeners count the bees and the birds and the butterflies on native plants, because I think that's important for people, for somebody who's not a scientist to rate how much they like the plant, and also then have the gardeners judge which plant is prettier on a lot of different, aspects of pretty and beauty. So, very simple stuff, just takes time, just takes a little bit of money and coordination.
That's great. This next question, I have to bring something up ahead of it, and that's one of our local teachers here, Cindy Zaks, just won an award for Teacher of the Year. And the question to follow that up is, how do we bring youth into the conservation conversation? Almost got that backwards. And it's for any of our panelists, so feel free to jump in as you'd like.
I'll start it, but it's a good one. Hello, hello. Is this working? Or I can just talk. Well, one of the key things that we do is we have an educational branch inside the park. So I've got Karen Davidson and her team that are actively in classrooms in the Coachella Valley and the Morongo Basin, engaging kids, because it blows my mind, but it costs so much to bring a bus, into the park. When I worked in Kansas, we could give out donations for like $60, and we'd get a bus for like an entire day. In California, it's like $600 for a bus for a whole day. So it's a different cost parameter. So it's very difficult to get kids into the park. So we bring the park in with the kids. I mentioned the Otis project earlier of the kids over in LA. One of their ideas they came up was create a traveling garden, with rocks and gardens and plants that you can bring into the classroom, and show them what a Joshua tree looks like, and show them what Chuparosa looks like, and some of the species of animals that you have inside the park to foster that love inside the classroom. So that's one way. Volunteering is a great way to work with kids. If the school district starts making mandatory public service as part of a graduation requirement, then you start seeing kids looking for more and more opportunities to volunteer. So that's another tool you can use. So there's a couple ideas. I could talk for a long time, but I don't want to.
No, I think those are all good points, and I would agree. Wildlands Conservancy also has outdoor education programs, and the busing is a constant challenge. But there are grants and funding sources that a lot of folks don't think about, including the school districts and our teachers. And so I think any of us that can help spread that message that, whether it's Bank of America or Wells Fargo or Target or Kohl's, a lot of them will do education grants for transportation funding. And unfortunately, because outdoor education is not a priority in a lot of our school districts, it needs to come from the community that this is a priority and this is important. So
there's an organization called Nature Bridge. They have 6 campuses across the United States at different national parks. Joshua Tree was just designated as one of their new places they'd like to really expand into. The city of 29 Palms has donated 100 acres adjacent to the park in the Indian Cove area to make this a reality. So ideally, over the next 4 or 5 years, with some amazing fundraising from some of our local advocates, we're going to see a campus there where kids can live in the park or adjacent to the park, and they can spend their day for 2 or 3 or 4 days in the park having those experiences. It's expensive, but by partnering with other organizations, partnering with philanthropists, we can make it a reality. Because let's face it, the Morongo Basin is not Beverly Hills. We don't have the money that other communities do in California. So we need to have other benefactors and other advocates that are out there raising funds for us to be able to do this.
Great. The next question is about invasive plants and elevated levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this questioner read an article recently about the greening of the deserts from an increase in carbon dioxide. And so can you take us through, any of us, why that's necessarily a bad thing, right? I mean, we like grass, right? And isn't CO2 food for plants?
So we're seeing a greening of the deserts right now, not necessarily related to CO2, but because of the nitrogen fixation that's coming down from acid rain. The author might have confused the molecules, as I'm apt to do, having not taken science in 7th grade, I think. But maybe you can.
Yeah, you're correct. It's nitrogen. We're fertilizing the desert. The brown stuff in smog is basically fertilizer that's airborne. And as it slowly moves its way across Southern California, it deposits as fertilizer, and the plants are being fertilized, which is great for all plants, but most of the exotic plants do really great with fertilizer. So you can fertilize poppies and they will grow larger, but if you fertilize grasses, they'll grow twice as big. And if you're constantly fertilizing them a little bit every year, there's years where they get a little bit of extra rainfall, we'll have an El Nino or whatever, and they just go bonkers. And in my scientific expertise, they go bonkers. And so, yeah, the greening in the desert is mostly nitrogen. And it's not going to be abated anytime soon. However, the nitrogen levels in Southern California are actually much less than they used to be. The smog is less brown. That's a good thing. It's still brown, but it's a good thing. It sounds like an economist, you know. The economy is slowly moving, but it's getting better. It's just going to take time.
As a follow-up, can you talk about desert plants are adapted to live in low nitrogen environments, and these grasses and other non-natives are not adapted to live in low nitrogen environments. Can you talk about the biology of the native versus non-native
Yeah, our
plants?
soils are naturally low in a lot of plant nutrients, and the Mediterranean, where most of these plants come from, like the grasses, are mostly all from the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean has a naturally moderate level of nutrients in the soil, mostly nitrogen, but a couple others. And so they came from a semi-naturally fertilized system. They came to California where they had a low nitrogen system, and they spread on their own, but they didn't do superb. And then with the advent of cars and the airborne fertilizer that we're giving them, they just went crazy because we're fertilizing them, and so we're giving them the conditions just like the Mediterranean, and yet the conditions that our native plants are now getting is not anything that they're used to. So they're used to low nitrogen soils, and now we're giving them moderate to high nitrogen soils. And you can see this across the park. If you're on the western end of the park, there's a lot of exotic grasses, and as you move out of that smog zone to the eastern end of the park, and the eastern end of the California desert for that matter, where nitrogen deposition is mostly fallen out, there's not as many exotic grasses.
Very good, thank you. Chris. So this is to David Smith, but I'm sure it's going to elicit other comments. Most of the people who live here agree in principle that we must replace fossil fuels with renewable. But we disagree with the Department of the Interior's current policy on utility-scale renewables. And the question specifically is, how do we bring Secretary Jewell here to explain why a better policy is developing rooftop solar? And maybe of the larger picture, the larger issue here is, how do we effectively give input into these huge federal processes?
Well, I'll start at the latter part of the question. What April was talking about earlier about you being advocates for what you believe in, it is truly essential. I can't stress that enough. Every comment that you make as part of the NEPA process, is actually looked at for federal agencies. The BLM is not always the best at actually modifying their plans based on that. But in general, I will tell you from the Park Service perspective, every comment you make on anything that we're doing inside the park, we are looking at, and we're considering it and possibly modifying our final action. So your comments are very, very important. So what I'm getting right now from the department is the president and the secretary are concerned about how do we make alternative energy viable, 24/7. And so they're looking at different mechanisms for actually having power production, at off hours. That's why a project like Eagle Crest actually has some advocates in the administration. That's why these solar power towers, like the one that's being proposed at the former Palin site, they switched it over to be molten salt as opposed to the other heating element that was being used. That molten salt can continue to produce power for 6 to 8 hours after the sun goes down. So those are the kind of projects that this administration, our president, is looking for so that we can have continuous energy at the night. So can you do that with rooftop solar right now? I would imagine someday we're going to have technology where we have battery units inside of houses that can store the stuff that we're producing during the daytime, so this will become a moot point. So we need to become advocates for that kind of technology. How do we get the secretary here? She's been here twice in the last year. She likes this area, so I don't think it's hard to get her to come out to this area. And she's one of the most articulate and intelligent people I've ever talked to, with a really good science background and some pretty good political savvy. So she's a pleasure to talk to, and I think you'd be interested in what she has to say.
She hasn't spoken to us.
I know, man. That's, what can I say? My husband cooked for her, and I think that was key, because he's a really good cook. So.
That's good. And any other comments about the larger process, input, how to give input into that huge, complicated process?
Yeah. So I think, as David pointed out, individual comments are incredibly important. And since we have a little bit of a break here in terms of, federal subsidies and how many utility scale projects are on public desert land, for example, in California, there's an opportunity to really advance the conversation about rooftop solar, about more local and distributed energy, and that takes working with our local elected officials. Town of Yucca Valley, San Bernardino County, these are all entities that really have an opportunity to advance our renewable energy future in our portfolio in a really progressive way without harming our treasured landscapes. And that's going to take education from all of us individually, because they don't have the time to read all the articles and be as up to speed as many of us in this room are on the topic. And it's really important to keep bringing, whether it's the Board of Supervisors along or Secretary Jewell's office, it takes constant engagement on all of our parts. So.
That's great. And another kind of follow-up question to that is, how do the existing environmental laws in the area affect the Interior Department's policy about developing renewable energy? Is there conflict there with things like the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Wilderness Act, and other laws that can protect national parks from external threats?
I've decided that Ferc law and water law in the state of California are more important than the Bible. I think that's probably the most, it's bizarre that these things are so powerful and can push everything else out.
What is FERC?
FERC is the federal, help me out,
Energy Regulatory Commission.
Right, so that's the federal licensing agency when there's a new power project, when it's approved. Man, it is tough to get around that. The rest of the laws, it seems like my experience has been that the administration's willing to sway on. So you can always mitigate matters when it comes to golden eagles or archaeological sites or other things. But once FERC has actually gone ahead and made a decision, it's very difficult to actually change that decision at all. So all of these laws are very, very important. They all get added into the final equation. But it comes down from the administration. If the administration really feels strongly that this is a direction we need to move in, like Undersecretary Salazar, I mean, he was gung-ho. He thought his marching orders were lots and lots and lots of development in the California desert. It has changed. It's because of advocacy of folks like you. Secretary Jewell, a much different approach, a much more measured approach than Salazar had. If that's helpful.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I don't think there's really a conflict with those environmental laws. For me, it's more of a forest from the trees issue. We need to continue to educate, sort of decision makers and lawmakers to think about the big picture of not only climate change, but in terms of renewable energy siting, what is a responsible policy? And instead of looking at how can we mitigate one little project, taking a more holistic look at the cumulative impacts of these projects on, for example, the California desert, and are there other tools we can use to reach the same reduction in carbon emissions and still be responsible with our landscapes and open spaces.
We're going to take it back down into a little bit more details, and this question's for Chris. Chris, there are many varieties of mesquite. Is honey mesquite the only good native plant in the garden? For example, around here, you'll see that honey mesquite has giant thorns, and people seem to not like thorns, so they've grown out this Chilean mesquite that's sold in most of the nurseries. And Chilean mesquite's not native to the area, but it's very widespread in landscaping. It's drought tolerant. Honey mesquite, you really can't find it at local nurseries. It's very difficult to find. So species by species.
The whole list, or so I guess.
Yeah, the whole list, Chris.
Yeah, there are many different kinds of mesquite. The the Chilean mesquite. So one of the studies that I didn't show you looked at, in back east, because everybody's doing this back east, looked at plants that have the same genus but different species. So like the American ash versus the European ash tree. And they found nearly the same result. When you have a native plant and a plant that's closely related but still from another part of the world, that plant still does not have as much wildlife on it, birds, bees, and butterflies, as the native plants do. So I completely understand that people don't want thorny plants in their backyard. That's always an issue. But the science is indicating that native plants have more wildlife on it. And so I'm not saying you have to have 100% native plants in your backyard. I'm just saying the more the merrier. And so far, the landscaping industry hasn't quite seen that there could or is demand, and part of that is public education and outreach, is to get people to want more native plants in their landscaping. I can almost guarantee you that if more people ask for thornless native mesquite, there's some enterprising nurserymen out there who will find a way to grow it. They did it with Palo Verde. There is thornless Palo Verde out there. It's a hybrid of several different native Palo Verdes, but it's out there. I'm sure they can figure out how to do that with other plants. The resources for the exact plants for your exact backyard are quite limited right now, so it will take a lot of work for you. We could have the same talk for an hour, and I could literally go through the nuts and bolts of how to find these plants for your specific backyard. But I think that it's similar to renewable energy. 5 to 7 years ago, we were in a completely different landscape with renewable energy than we are today. And I'm hoping that in 5 to 7 years from now, we'll be in a completely different landscape when it comes to native plants in our backyard.
If I'm not mistaken, doesn't MDLT have some pretty spectacular greenhouses behind their new property? More native plants?
My, that's a good point, David.
I was also just going to add quickly that Robin Thompson from the Summer Tree Institute has a lot of information about local nurseries and nurseries that'll provide native plants, and you can always plant the thorny mesquite in a particular corner of your backyard or prune it in a certain way. So.
That's right. Mesquite is one of those great tough plants when you plant it. It's hard to get rid of. There are people on the other side of the planet complaining about that invasive honey mesquite, just like we complain about our mustard. Yeah, Texas, right? And the Summer Tree Institute is online. Robin's got some great resources there for some of our local natives that are great in landscapes. So again, for our panelists, particularly David and April, what kinds of local engagement, for instance with Riverside and San Bernardino County, could raise commitment to their production, to their reduction of greenhouse gas emissions? So what can we do to work locally here with our county governments to try and get greenhouse gas emissions down?
Why don't you go first?
Okay.
All right.
So I'm sure George can relate to this, but our local elected officials have a lot on their plate. They hear from a lot of different people on a lot of different issues. And so I'm going to have to say that persistence is quite key in this question and this topic. And so myself, for example, I've met with almost all of the Board of Supervisors individually, repeatedly on these topics. And it takes constant, reminders, both with the board, with their staff, with planning staff and other departments. They have a lot on their plate, and they have the biggest county in the country. They have a lot to cover. And so I think it's really important to be strategic and to be persistent about, keeping sort of their feet to the fire on some deliverables, because we have a lot of support, I think, from our local county supervisor and from some of the other supervisors on the board, but they have a lot of people tugging on their coattails, and so persistence and continuity is important.
Okay, so this is just a word of advice. So I worked in DC for 2 years, and I worked on the committee that dealt with national park legislation. And I had lobbyists come into our office, every single day. And they were lobbyists for wild horses. They were lobbyists for off-road vehicle use. They were lobbyists for climbing access. They were every particular lobbyist that was funded by someone, I think, stopped in my office in those 2 years. And the congressman that I was working for, Mr. Grijalva from Tucson, he doesn't know a lot about climbing advocacy. He did not know a lot about wild horses until the wild horse ladies started showing up. So lobbyists do play a really important role in educating members of Congress and assemblymen. The more you can spend time with Mr. Ruiz's office in the Valley, or Mr. Cook's office, or Mr. Calvert over in Corona, he's the chair of appropriations for the House of Representatives. You need to stop by with your important issues, cafe standards, talking about that, renewable energy issues that you care about. The more you can spend time with your congressional staff, those people that are writing the legislation, the congressman is not writing legislation, it's his staff members that are. So that's what I would advocate. Just be a presence, be a thorn in the side, be that greasy wheel, greasy cog, greasy whatever. Just be greasy. Squeaky, no, be squeaky, not greasy. It's been a long day. I've been up for a long time so far.
Greasy wheels don't squeak.
Yes, that's true.
It's a problem. We'll drill back into a detail here. Chris, can you talk about use of herbicides on some of these really widespread invasives like Sahara mustard or red brome? How do we combat those things with herbicides?
Ooh. So, yes, it's possible. Yes, it's possible to treat these widespread, large-scale invasions with herbicides. But then on the long term, does it really matter if you treat, a 100-acre patch of Sahara mustard and keep it free? Will that patch remain, free of weeds for the next 50 years? Probably not. But are there places worth protecting? And are herbicides a tool to do that? I personally think absolutely, and I think that's the way to do it. I understand that there's people who are opposed to using chemicals, and that's perfectly fine. So on the grand scheme of things, we're getting a lot of new weeds that are coming to Southern California. There's a couple that I'm working on that are probably worse than Sahara mustard. And it keeps me up at night thinking about how do we combat these new weeds that aren't even here yet, but they're in other parts of the California desert working their way across. And so some of these things are just going to be the new Sahara mustard or the new brome grasses, and we're going to be stuck with them. We're not going to stop bringing plants from all over the world, either on purpose or accidentally. I mean, people like to go to Australia on vacation. Somebody is inadvertently going to bring back a seed on a sock because they went hiking in the outback. It's going to end up in California. The odds are very, very small, but there's enough people that it's going to happen. So we're kind of looking at this flood of exotic species, and on the grand scheme of things, there's not much we're going to be able to do about it because our economy is churning along. But there are places worth protecting, and we need to do something about that, and we need to save those places. So I can't tell you where that line is, but I can tell you that there's big things that are going to be bad for California that are going on in the world, and there are really special places that we need to protect. And everybody in this room has a different point on that spectrum as to where they want to invest their energy. And that's just going to have to be a personal decision.
So we just completed a contract with a team that we have that works in the Mojave District of National Park sites, and they were historically they've eradicated tamarisk populations, in where you have seeps, where you have water coming up in the desert. If a tamarisk grove gets really entrenched in a seep, they will suck up, every drop of water, and any wildlife, any bighorn sheep species that were dependent in those areas, they're out of the picture. This crew that we just had inside the park, they were focusing in on fountain grass. and they were using herbicides. Herbicides, the lowest level we thought was safe for using inside the park, but it was making an entry into canyons down by Cottonwood in the southern portion of the park. It was the one place where it was showing up. So you hammer it hard, and hopefully it's out of the picture. So there is, I as a park manager, I do see a role for those decisions, because if we don't, the consequence could be losing bighorn sheep in that portion of the park because of that, or another section of the park burning that's really sensitive.
Yeah, and I mentioned a little bit, we live in the Anthropocene. We now need to figure out what we are and aren't going to manage. And so we're going to take our limited resources and we're going to figure out, is it worth it to combat this plant or this pest here versus doing something else? And we are going to have to make that decision. And that's not a decision that our grandparents or even beyond that had to make. But we now have that decision, and my children are going to have even worse decisions than that. So I'm hoping that we can at least step up to the plate and make those tough decisions now, rather than not make them and leave a worse place in 5, 10, 20 years.
So that's a good segue to a question directly for David. What is your dream about Joshua Tree National Park and all national parks for now and into the future?
What is my dream for all national parks in the future? I have a dream. I have a dream that our workforce across the national parks across the United States will reflect the people of the United States, and that they will be a palette of colors that represents all different Americans. I have a dream that all of our parks will tell the American story, collaboratively. They'll tell about all of our different ecosystems. They will tell about all of our historical legacies and the importance of that. I dream that our parks are these learning areas where we can learn about exotic plant removal and the relationship, the symbiotic relationship between animals and plants and humans. I dream that we are setting the standard for the rest of the nation when it comes to alternative energy and how we do business inside of national parks, and we do it in a way that does not damage the environment. So that's my dream picture I'd like to have. I also would like to have enough money that I could staff the park adequately, and I have rangers in the backcountry that are preventing people from looting archaeological sites, and I have enough educational rangers that I can send them to every classroom that wants a program, and all those needs are being met. So that's my big dream. But I'm going to dream tonight, except for all the coffee that I drank. I don't know if I'm going to dream at all, but I do want to dream tonight.
So I've heard it once that you never want to have to worry about money, which is why you always want to have a lot of it. So we'll take maybe just a minute, and we'll wrap up on this question, a minute for each panelist to go through and tell us what they think that the single most important issue that could impact our region is. So we'll start with you, David. You've got a minute.
Let's start with Chris, okay?
Oh, man. The single most important issue.
I know it's going to be about plants, right?
Probably not. The single most.
I'll go.
You got something? I need a minute to think.
Okay.
Wow.
Sketch something out?
Yeah.
I'm gonna say it's engagement and being engaged in your community and the issues that are upon all of us, because as I talked about before, it's really easy and certainly a lesson I learned and experienced personally, the thought that there's somebody else out there fighting that battle, or there's somebody else doing that research, or there's a big government entity to fund this or that, and often it's not true, and it comes down to individual and local and regional advocacy working its way up the food chain. And so I think that all of these issues are important. Climate change, we do not yet know the impacts to the desert, and it's going to be a constant test of adaptive management and many other things. And as a land manager myself, there are so many things that are continuing to be little fires on the plate, and the most important thing that I think we can do is be engaged and bring resources, both volunteers and funds and new youth advocates to the table, because there's a lot at stake.
I've got one if you don't.
I got it.
Okay, I'll let you go. It's
Okay. All right. Education. I think it's all, this morning I was teaching kids about native bees. Very fun activity. Not what the bulk of what my career is very tangential, but it's about education. It's about teaching people about things that are unique or interesting or just special to us. I mean, our parents and grandparents have told us the things that are important to them, and we take that with a grain of salt sometimes, and that's fine. But education, other people need to or want to know what is important to us. We're all asking each other, what's our opinion about something? We're looking to be educated. So I think that's a huge issue in teaching kids about things. It's going to take 10 years, 20 years for them to grow up, but they are learning the values that we are teaching them. Millennials are some of the most cooperative people, the cohort demographics on this planet, and we're teaching them. The Gen Xers, like myself, we were taught, you can do it yourself. You are strong. You are independent. And now we're teaching people, you're strong and be a part of a team. And they're getting the message. The Army, when I was watching TV all day long after school, the message the Army was saying, an army of one. You can do it. Now what's the message from the Army? What's the slogan?
Be all you can be.
Not to be all you can be. A force for a greater good. It's a team message. It's good. It's not an army of one. So the message we're giving people is actually getting through. It doesn't seem like it, but it's actually working. I think we see that with renewable energy in the desert. I hope we see that with native plants in our landscapes. I know we see that with kids, and you teach a kid water conservation, and they make their parents conserve water. It's like the dumbest thing ever. But how do you get a 5-year-old to teach a parent about it? You teach the 5-year-old, and the 5-year-old teaches the parent. I think the other thing is economics. And we really need to be good economists. And I think we are all good economists intuitively. But I think that as consumers get educated and are smarter about their choices and make good economic decisions, then they change the world. Rooftop solar is purely a technological and an economic problem. 10 years ago, it was prohibitively expensive for most people to have rooftop solar. Now you can do it, and in the time frame of owning your home, you can buy back your panels through the energy that you're saving. This wasn't possible 10 years ago. It was basically sinking money into having black things on your roof. Now, we've changed the economics of it. So many people want this technology. It's very cheap. And now we have it. And that's partly because of education economics.
That was good. That was a good 1 minute. That was an amazing 1 minute.
Yes.
Okay. Civic engagement. Constant civic engagement from the Park Service, working with the owners of our national parks. I just met with my law enforcement staff yesterday for their 40-hour refresher, and my argument to them was, if you spend 2 hours in the campground talking to visitors about their park and their issues inside the park and their areas of concern, that is the best time you can possibly spend. It's far better doing that than writing a report back in the office or doing a speed trap somewhere inside the park. I want you engaged with the public because it's going to invigorate them and it's going to get them thinking themselves. For me as a park manager, I need to be listening to what the people out in Desert Center think about potentials of things going on in the park. I need to be in 29 Palms at the city council meeting, hearing and dialoguing with people. I need to be out in the community. I expect every one of my staff to be out in the community. When we're designing educational programs based on national curriculum standards, we really need to know what the teachers in Yucca Valley actually need from their students. Are they dealing with the audience there at that school? What are their needs? Are they having a hard time getting a job? Maybe when we're doing our educational program, we're going to focus more on careers in the National Park Service. So that kind of two-way dialogue, as opposed to everything coming from the top, this is the Park Service way of doing things. No, I want to hear what the public has to say, because in the end, you are our constituents. we owe our jobs to you, we owe our parks to you all, and so we need to get feedback from you, we need to listen to it. So I would say civic engagement is my issue.
Great. So we had be engaged, educate and get educated, and civic engagement were kind of the three final take-homes. So that just about wraps us up for the night. Thank you to our panelists. And thanks very much to the Joshua Tree National Park Association, its board of directors, and particularly to the co-sponsor of this entire lecture series event this year, Copper Mountain College. It's been a great place to be. So thank you, Copper Mountain and the association. If you have questions for our panelists, they usually kind of hang out for a few minutes, so jump on them. Have a good night and have a safe drive home.
Thank you.